Welcome to Whole Word Ministries. Thank you for joining us for our study, Whose Land Is It Anyways? There are two groups vying for the authority to govern the Holy Land, the Palestinians and the Jews. So whose land is it? And who determines the criteria by which we answer that question? Should the decision be based on the identity of the original inhabitants, on genetics, on religious affiliation? None of these standards can be proven to anyone's universal satisfaction. Should it depend on which group is behaving more or less violently, or which governing authority is more or less corrupt? Those two are nearly impossible to establish conclusively. Another complication is whether we're discussing individuals or entire people groups. As individuals, we naturally belong first and foremost to the place where we were born and raised. That doesn't mean we can't belong elsewhere as well, but our birthplace is undeniably a primary point of belonging. Even if we settle the question of which individuals belong in the land by concluding that those born and raised there have a legitimate personal claim, we're still left with a separate issue. Who has the right to govern the land? Because these are two distinct questions. Only after clarifying the question of governance can we meaningfully discuss how that governing authority treats the various groups under its care. Unfortunately, conversations about this topic often blend these three issues, individual belonging, collective identity, and political governance, into one, making the entire situation far more difficult to resolve. This question can be applied to virtually any region of the world, not only the Levant. We face a similar debate here in Canada. One branch of my family has lived in North America for nearly 4 centuries, yet there are still those who would claim that I don't belong here, an assertion that is frankly unreasonable. Even those who identify as the original inhabitants of this land are not truly the first, according to both genetic research and their own oral histories. Their ancestors arrived around the AD 400s, and archaeological evidence indicates that other peoples were already living here when they came. So does their earlier arrival, by roughly 1200 years, grant them a greater right to the land than those whose ancestors arrived later? Does the fact that their forefathers conquered the previous inhabitants give them a stronger claim than mine? These questions reveal how complicated and inconsistent the idea of historical entitlement can become when we try to apply it universally. A compelling argument can be made that land belongs to the most recent conquerors. Another strong argument can be made that it belongs to the very first people ever to set foot on it. But no consistent argument can be made for those who fall somewhere in between. There's simply no reliable way to identify the original inhabitants of any region on Earth to everyone's satisfaction, because human beings have been migrating, settling, and displacing one another throughout all of recorded and unrecorded history. For this reason, if the secular world were to adopt a single, universally applicable standard, the only criterion that could be applied fairly and consistently would be the claim of the most recent conquerors. Any other standard becomes impossible to verify or enforce without descending into selective history, subjective interpretation, or ideological preference. However, this is a biblical study, not a secular one. Therefore, we turn to Scripture, which provides a definitive answer to the question, whose land is it anyways? According to Genesis 17 verse 8 and Galatians 3 verse 16, the land ultimately belongs to Yeshua Messiah, Jesus Christ. He will one day return for his people and his land, establishing his millennial kingdom. Genesis 17 verse 8, and I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Galatians 3 verse 16, now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. Daniel 2 verses 44 to 45. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and destroy all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Because you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke the iron, the copper, the clay, the silver, and the gold in pieces. The great God made known to the king what shall occur after this. And the dream is certain, and the meaning of it is trustworthy. Revelation 20 verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. In truth, we could conclude our study at this point, having already answered the central question: the land belongs to Yeshua Messiah. However, until his return, two distinct groups currently lay claim to it. We need to resolve the issue of who has the right to govern the land. In order to do that, we must focus on people groups, not individuals, and resist the urge to include arguments related to how that government treats the people. The two people groups in question are the Palestinians and the Jews, so let's examine who they are. The significance of a name shouldn't be underestimated. In this case, two groups are invoking ancient names to reinforce the legitimacy of their claims to the Promised Land. As a result, the names themselves and the histories behind them are highly relevant. Understanding the origins of these terms, the peoples who first used them, and the historical outcome of those communities is essential to evaluating the claims being made. Philistine or Palestinian. The historical evolution of the name Palestine and the identity of the Philistines. The name Palestine has deep linguistic and historical roots that trace back to the ancient Near East. Its earliest form appears in the Hebrew term Pelesheth, which is used throughout the Bible to describe the land of the Philistines. The Philistines were a coastal people who figure prominently in Israel's early history. Pelesheth occurs 8 times in reference to Philistia and nearly 300 times in relation to the Philistines themselves. The term functioned not only as a geographical label, but also as a theological marker within Israel's history. It symbolized Israel's encounters with powerful neighbors along its western frontier. From this Semitic origin, the name entered the wider Mediterranean world through the Greek Palestinae and the Latin Palestina, and eventually becoming the administrative term adopted by the Roman Empire. Egyptian inscriptions from the 12th century BC also reference a group called the Peleset, widely believed to be the same as the biblical Philistines, though Egyptian orthography substitutes R for L. What began as a specific ethnogeographic designation for Philistine territory gradually expanded in meaning, eventually applying to a broader region of the southern Levant. So, the evolution of the name reflects a complex interplay of linguistic transmission, imperial administration, and ancient cultural identity. Greek and Roman usage further shaped the term's development. Writing in the 5th century BC, Herodotus employed Palestinae to describe a stretch of land along the eastern Mediterranean, indicating that the name had already entered the Hellenic geographical vocabulary. The Romans later adopted the term as Palestina, initially applying it to the coastal territory associated with the Philistines. After suppressing the Bar Kokhba revolt, however, in AD 135, Roman authorities reorganized the region and renamed the province of Judea as Syria Palestina, extending the term to include Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Many scholars interpret this renaming as part of Rome's effort to weaken Jewish national identity by replacing a traditional biblical designation with one rooted in the Philistine name. Archaeological and historical evidence reinforces the deep antiquity of the term Palestine and its gradual broadening in scope. Egyptian inscriptions from the late Bronze Age mentioned the Peleset, one of the so-called sea peoples whose arrival in the eastern Mediterranean during the early Iron Age coincided with major population movements and cultural shifts along the Levantine coast. These references corroborate the biblical Philistines and situate them within wider patterns of migration. Over the centuries, the geographic meaning of Palestine expanded from the narrow Philistine coastal plain to a much larger region, encompassing significant portions of the southern Levant. By the Ottoman period, however, the area was not administered as a single political unit, but divided among several provinces. The name re-emerged as an official territorial designation only with the establishment of the British Mandate in 1920, when European powers revived and standardized the term, according to modern political and cartographic conventions. So for a quick recap of what we've learned so far. Biblically, the word Palestine is derived from Pelesheth, referring to Philistia, homeland of the Philistines. Historically and linguistically, the word Palestine entered Greek and Latin as Palestinae, Palestina, and expanded under Roman rule. Archaeologically, the word Palestine is connected to the Peleset, a sea peoples group mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. And in modern usage, the word Palestine has been revived as a political geographic term under the British Mandate of 1920. The biblical portrayal of the Philistines provides further insight into the origins of the name. Their story begins in the Table of Nations, Genesis 10 verses 13 to 14, where they're listed among the descendants of Misraim, the son of Ham. The prophets Amos and Jeremiah associate them with Kaftor, which is possibly Crete or Cyprus, suggesting maritime origins. At the time of the patriarchs, the Philistines were firmly settled in the southwestern coastal region of Canaan, where Abraham and Isaac interact with Abimelech, king of Gerar. These narratives depict a politically organized society with kings, armies, and fortified urban centers. During the period of the Judges, the Philistines emerge as one of Israel's most persistent adversaries. The story of Samson portrays them as dominant over parts of Israel, prompting Yahweh to raise Samson as a deliverer. Their power continues into the rise of the monarchy. Saul's reign is marked by continual warfare with them, culminating in his death at their hands, while David's early career is defined by both conflict and uneasy alliance with Philistine rulers. Throughout the historical books, the Philistines are consistently associated with the Pentapolis, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, a confederation of 5 major city-states that highlights their cohesion and regional influence. Archaeology complements and enriches this biblical portrait. Excavations confirm the Pentapolis as major Philistine centers and reveal a material culture with strong Asian influences, especially in pottery styles, architecture, and religious iconography. Their dietary habits, including a higher consumption of pork than neighboring Canaanites, further distinguish them. While the biblical texts emphasize religious and military conflict, archaeology provides the cultural depth behind these tensions, illustrating a society with its own rich traditions and evolving identity. Over time, Philistine culture became increasingly Canaanized, blending with local customs even as their political power waned. By the Neo-Babylonian period, Philistine cities were destroyed or transformed, and by the 5th century BC, their distinct identity had disappeared, absorbed into the broader populations of the region. Yet their name endured, carrying forward through Greek and Roman usage and eventually applied to a much larger territory than the one they'd originally inhabited. Comparing the biblical and archaeological accounts, on origin, the Bible indicates Kaftor, Egyptian lineage, and archaeology shows they were Asian migrants, the Sea Peoples. The Bible doesn't emphasize migration, whereas archaeology indicates a major migration around 12th century BC. In the Bible, they are an ethnic group in Canaan. In archaeology, they're found to be a distinct culture with foreign roots. How Palestine became linked to modern Palestinian identity. The modern linkage between the name Palestine and a distinct Palestinian national identity is a relatively recent development emerging gradually in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For centuries prior, Palestine functioned primarily as a geographic designation, not an ethnic or national one. Under successive empires, Roman, Byzantine, early Islamic, and Ottoman, the term referred to administrative districts whose boundaries shifted according to political needs rather than to any unified people. And the name itself was typically imposed by outside powers, and its meaning evolved in accordance with changing imperial priorities rather than local self-identification. During the late Ottoman period, the inhabitants of the region, predominantly Arab-speaking Muslims and Christians, identified themselves chiefly through religious affiliation, local clan networks, or city-based loyalties. While the term Palestinian did appear sporadically in Arabic and European writings, it carried a geographical rather than a national connotation. It was not yet a marker of collective political identity. A decisive transformation occurred under the British Mandate, 1920 to 1948, when the name Palestine was formalized as the official designation for the territory. Administrative documents, passports, and legal instruments issued by the Mandate authorities labeled all residents, Arabs, Jews, and others, as Palestinians. Within this framework, the Arab population increasingly adopted the term as a national identifier, especially in political movements, newspapers, and emerging cultural political institutions. This shift was catalyzed by broader forces: the rise of Arab nationalism, the growth of Zionist immigration and political organization, and the perceived need for a unified communal voice in the face of rapid social and demographic change. The Nakba of 1948, which resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Arab inhabitants, played a profound role in solidifying Palestinian identity. Refugee communities scattered across the Middle East began to conceive of themselves as a single people bound by shared memory, loss, and longing for return. In this context, Palestinian became not merely a geographic label, but a symbol of collective trauma, endurance, and national aspiration. From the 1960s onward, Palestinian identity became further institutionalized with the founding of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, in 1964, which articulated a coherent national narrative on the international stage. Today, Palestinian identity encompasses a rich tapestry of shared cultural traditions, historical connection to the land, political experience, and a widespread diaspora shaped by displacement. As scholars often note, Arabs living in the region began calling themselves Palestinians relatively recently, adopting the term in part to anchor their national movement within a larger historical continuum. Thus, the modern Palestinian identity represents a dynamic interplay of geography, memory, political struggle, and evolving self-understanding. So, to summarize how the name became a modern identity. In the ancient Ottoman period, it was a geographic term with no unified ethnic or national meaning. During the British Mandate, it was turned into an administrative identity that was increasingly adopted by Arab inhabitants as a national label. And by post-1948, Palestinian identity was shaped by displacement, nationalism, and shared struggle. From the 1960s to present day, it had become a fully developed national identity with political institutions and global recognition. Jewish or Judaite, the name. The English word Jew is the product of a long chain of linguistic transmission, Hebrew to Aramaic to Greek to Latin to Old French to English. Each stage reflects historical shifts, from tribal identity to religious community to a global ethnocultural term. The variety of historical equivalents across languages emphasizes the antiquity and wide geographical spread of Jewish identity. This is a compact overview of major historical equivalents and their contexts. The Hebrew Yehudi, which means of Judah, first meant of the single tribe of Judah, then of the kingdom of Judah, and finally of Judea. In Aramaic, Yehuda, from the same or origin root word as the Hebrew, was used in Near Eastern contexts. The Greek, Iudaios, was used in the Septuagint, New Testament, and classical sources. In Latin, Judea. This was the standard Roman term and was the basis for medieval European forms. Old French, Guillou. This intermediate form led to the English Jew. Middle English, EU or Guillou, varied spellings before standardization. Middle French, Juif, a direct descendant of Old French, Guillou. German is Jude, comes through Latin influence. Spanish, Judeo, from the Latin Judea. Arabic, Yahudi, from the same origin root as the Hebrew, is widespread in Islamic lands. When we talk about what the Jewish people were doing and where they were living throughout different periods of history, we're referring to the communities known by the names their own time and place gave them. The people. From Judah to a scattered people, Jewish identity after AD 70. The destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70 marked a profound turning point in Jewish history. Although Jewish life in the Promised Land continued, the temple-centered system that had defined religious practice for centuries came to an abrupt end. The trauma deepened after the Bar Kokhba revolt, AD 132 to 135, when Rome crushed the uprising, killed or enslaved many Jews, and renamed Judea Syria Palestina. These events accelerated the dispersion of Jews across the Mediterranean and the Near East, setting the stage for a new era in which Jewish identity would be maintained without the temple in Jerusalem. In the centuries that followed, Jewish communities existed both in the Promised Land, particularly in Galilee, the Golan, and parts of the coastal plain, and throughout the Roman Empire. Significant populations lived in Babylonia, Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, and North Africa. Across these diverse regions, Jews preserved a shared sense of peoplehood through religious law, communal institutions, and a growing body of sacred texts. Synagogues, study houses, and local courts became the backbone of communal life, while the Mishnah and later the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds codified Jewish law and religious memory. These texts consistently invoked Israel, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel, reinforcing a collective identity that transcended geography. Archaeology and contemporary writings confirm this continuity. Synagogues adorned with menorahs and Hebrew inscriptions appear across the Mediterranean, while Roman sources refer to the Iudei as a distinct ethno-religious group. Rabbinic literature, meanwhile, reflects an enduring attachment to Zion and Jerusalem, even as Jewish life increasingly unfolded far from that place. By late antiquity and into the early Middle Ages, Babylonia emerged as the leading center of Jewish scholarship. Under Sasanian and later Islamic rule, the great academies of Sura and Pumbedita produced the Babylonian Talmud, which became the central text of Jewish law. The Geonim, heads of these academies, corresponded with communities from Spain to Yemen, guiding a far-flung but interconnected Jewish world. Smaller yet symbolically important communities persisted in the Promised Land, while Jews also lived throughout Byzantine territories, North Africa, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. Jewish identity during this period was defined by birth or conversion and by participation in shared religious practices such as Sabbath observance, festivals, dietary laws, and circumcision. Letters and responsa reveal that Jews across continents saw themselves as one people, bound by common law and a shared historical memory. The medieval Cairo Geniza provides vivid evidence of this interconnected world. Its thousands of preserved documents, letters, contracts, liturgical texts, show Jews referring to themselves as Yehudim and maintaining communal structures from Egypt to Yemen and Spain. Islamic and Christian sources likewise describe Jews as a distinct minority community, whether under the status of dhimmi in Muslim lands or as a protected yet often vulnerable group in Christian Europe. During the High Middle Ages, Jewish life stretched across both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. In Muslim lands, from Al-Andalus to Persia, Jews participated in trade, medicine, scholarship, and administration. In Christian Europe, Ashkenazic communities developed in the Rhineland and northern France, before expanding eastward into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Despite regional differences, Jews shared core religious practices and maintained Hebrew as a sacred language. Everyday speech developed into distinct Jewish languages, Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, and Yiddish, often written in Hebrew script, reinforcing communal boundaries. Liturgical poetry and prayers for the rebuilding of Jerusalem kept alive a sense of exile and longing for Zion. Medieval charters, rabbinic writings, and even records of persecution all attest to Jews being recognized by themselves and by others as a distinct, continuous people. In the early modern period, new centers of Jewish life emerged following major expulsions. After 1492, many Sephardic Jews found refuge in the Ottoman Empire, settling in cities such as Salonika, Istanbul, Safed, and Jerusalem. Poland, Lithuania became a major hub of Ashkenazi life, while smaller communities grew in Amsterdam, London, and Italian cities. Jews also reached the New World, establishing communities in the Caribbean and North America. Throughout these shifts, Jewish identity remained anchored in communal autonomy, halakhic tradition, and a shared sense of peoplehood. Kehelot, which were organized Jewish communities, maintained courts, schools, and charitable institutions, while states often recognized Jews as a corporate body with specific rights and restrictions. Despite internal diversity, Jews across regions continued to see themselves as part of one people with a common heritage. Across nearly 2 millennia of dispersion, Jews preserved their identity through law, memory, language, and community. Whether in Babylonia, Spain, Poland, or the Ottoman Empire, they maintained a continuous sense of belonging to the people of Judah, rooted in ancient traditions, yet adaptable to new environments. The story of the Jewish diaspora after AD 70 is not only one of displacement, but also of remarkable cultural resilience and continuity. Jewish identity in the 19th and early 20th centuries, emancipation, nationalism, and the road to 1948. By the 19th century, Jews were spread across nearly every continent, forming one of the most geographically dispersed yet culturally interconnected peoples in the world. The largest communities lived in Eastern Europe, particularly within the Russian Empire and Poland, where millions of Ashkenazi Jews maintained dense networks of towns, villages, and urban centers. Significant populations also lived in Central and Western Europe, in Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Britain, and Italy, where new opportunities and challenges emerged with the rise of modern nation-states. Beyond Europe, long-standing Jewish communities thrived across the Middle East and North Africa, from Baghdad and Tehran to Morocco, Tunisia, and Yemen, as well as in Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, Hebron, and Jaffa. Meanwhile, the Americas became a growing destination, especially the United States, Argentina, and Canada, where Jewish immigrants established new communities. This period saw profound transformations in how Jews understood and expressed their identity. Religious life diversified as Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and other movements took shape, each defining itself in relation to Jewish tradition and peoplehood. At the same time, the rise of European nationalism prompted different responses among Jews. Some embraced integration into emerging nation-states, identifying as French, German, or Italian citizens of Jewish faith. Others developed or adopted Jewish nationalism, which is called Zionism, arguing that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a nation with a historic homeland in the Holy Land. Cultural creativity flourished as well. Yiddish and Hebrew literature, Jewish newspapers, and political movements such as the Bund, Zionist parties, and religious organizations all articulated a strong sense of collective Jewish identity. The evidence for this self-understanding is abundant. Censuses and state records often list Jews as a distinct religious or national category. Jewish newspapers, communal councils, and the proceedings of Zionist congresses explicitly spoke of the Jewish people and Eretz Israel. Modern genetic and historical studies further support the long-term continuity of Jewish populations, showing shared ancestry among many communities and links to the Eastern Mediterranean. Throughout these centuries, the Holy Land remained a living center of Jewish presence and aspiration. Although the population fluctuated, Jewish communities persisted in Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, Hebron, and later in Jaffa and new agricultural settlements. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of Zionist immigration called Aliyot from Eastern Europe and Yemen expanded the Jewish population and laid the foundations of the Yeshuv, which was the pre-state Jewish community in the Holy Land. The Yeshuv saw itself as both a continuation of the ancient people of Judea and a modern national revival. Its institutions, Hebrew schools, newspapers, political parties, and defense organizations explicitly framed themselves as expressions of Jewish nationhood. International recognition followed. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 affirmed British support for a national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, and the League of Nations mandate incorporated this language, acknowledging the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land and the legitimacy of their national aspirations. By 1948, Jews were a globally dispersed yet self-consciously continuous people. They shared core markers of identity, descent, religious law and practice, Hebrew texts, and a collective memory of exile and return. Their community stretched across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Americas, with a rapidly growing center in the Holy Land. A vast documentary record, religious writings, communal archives, state documents, archaeology, and languages converges on the same conclusion. Despite dispersion, Jews maintained a coherent and enduring sense of peoplehood. The declaration of the State of Israel in May 1948 did not create the Jewish people. Rather, it represented the political expression of a people whose identity had been preserved, debated, and lived across continents for nearly 2 millennia since the fall of the Second Temple. As we discussed at the beginning of this video, the only criteria for who has the right to rule that could be applied fairly and consistently would be the claim of the most recent conquerors. The governing authority of the Promised Land has changed many times since the Babylonians conquered the land in the 6th century BC. With each regime change came a change to the laws and sometimes the freedoms of the people living there. Babylon. When Judah fell to Babylon in 586 BC, much of the population was deported. This left southern Judah, especially the Negev, largely empty, and the Edomites moved into and occupied parts of the Promised Land. While Edomites were expanding into Judah, Arabian tribes, the Nabateans, moved into Edom's original territory around Petra. This pushed the Edomites even further into southern Judah. By the 4th century BC, the Edomites were fully relocated into what used to be southern Judah, the area later called Idumea. The Babylonian conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Medo-Persia. When the Medes and Persians conquered Babylonia, they allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, where they found the southern territory occupied by the Edomites. The Medo-Persian conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Greece. When Alexander the Great conquered the Near East in 332 BC, he brought far more than military power. His empire carried Greek languages, education, philosophy, and urban culture into regions that had never encountered them on such a scale. After his death, Judea passed first to the Ptolemies of Egypt from 301 to 200 BC, and then to the Seleucids of Syria from 200 to 164 BC. Both dynasties promoted Greek culture, though they did so with different motives and very different levels of pressure. The result was a long, complex negotiation between Jewish tradition and the expanding influence of Hellenism. This is a map of the Hellenistic world in 281 BC. Under the Ptolemies, Hellenization was largely voluntary and often appealing. Greek became the language of administration and commerce, and many Jews, especially in cosmopolitan centers like Alexandria, became bilingual. It was in Alexandria that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, was produced, marking a turning point in Jewish intellectual history. Greek education, particularly the gymnasium, became a symbol of prestige, and wealthy Jewish families increasingly sent their sons to study Greek literature, rhetoric, and philosophy. Urban life also shifted as cities were reorganized along Greek lines, complete with theaters, marketplaces, and civic councils. Many Jews adopted Greek names, explored Greek philosophical ideas, and experimented with Greek literary forms. Yet despite these cultural shifts, the Ptolemies generally respected Jewish religious autonomy, allowing religious practices to continue without interference. This situation changed dramatically with the Seleucids. Their rule made Hellenization more aggressive and politically charged. Several factors drove this shift. The Seleucids needed revenue. They sought loyalty from border regions like Judea, and internal Jewish factions competed for influence by aligning themselves with Greek rulers. Under Antiochus IV Epiphanes from 175 to 164 BC, cultural influence hardened into coercion. A gymnasium was built in Jerusalem. Jewish priests adopted Greek customs, and the high priesthood itself became a political commodity sold to the highest bidder. Antiochus went further, banning circumcision and Torah observance, and desecrating the Jerusalem temple with pagan sacrifices. This was no longer cultural influence. It was an assault on Jewish identity. The Greek conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. The Hasmonean dynasty. Antiochus' coercive policies provoked a full-scale revolt led by the Maccabees between 167 and 164 BC, a movement that reshaped Jewish history. Their victory brought the restoration of the Jerusalem temple, political independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, and a renewed emphasis on Torah observance and Jewish identity. Yet even in this moment of resistance, Hellenistic influence didn't vanish. Instead, it became something negotiated and adapted, absorbed into Jewish life on Jewish terms rather than imposed from above. This dynamic is especially visible in the Hasmonean expansion under John Hyrcanus I. Around 125 BC, Hyrcanus conquered Idumea, the region historically associated with the Edomites. According to Josephus, he required the Idumeans to adopt Jewish customs, undergo circumcision, and integrate fully into the Jewish nation. This policy created a new, complex identity. By the time of Jesus, the Idumeans were still recognized as ethnically distinct, yet they were considered religiously Jewish and part of the Judea's social fabric. The most famous product of this integration was Herod the Great. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean official whose family had been part of Jewish society for roughly a century. When Rome appointed Herod as king of Judea in 37 BC, the ruler presiding over the land at the time of Jesus' birth was, by ancestry, an Edomite. His rise illustrates the long-term consequences of the Hasmonean policies and the deep entanglement of ethnic, political, and religious identities in this late Second Temple period. Let's have a look at what we've learned so far. In 586 BC, Judea fell to Babylon and the Edomites moved into the land of Judah. From the 5th to 4th centuries BC, Nabateans took over the land the Edomites had partially evacuated, forcing the Edomites to relocate fully into Judah, creating the land of Idumea. In the 2nd century BC, the Maccabees conquered the land of Idumea and forced the Idumeans to adopt Judaism. Then in the 1st century BC, Herod's family, who were Idumeans, that is, Edomites, rose to power and the Idumeans became Judea's ruling class. Romans. Roman involvement in Judea began in 63 BC when Pompey the Great intervened in a Hasmonean civil war and captured Jerusalem. This moment marked the end of true Jewish independence and the beginning of a new political order in which Judea functioned as a client kingdom of Rome. Although the Hasmonean dynasty continued for a time, it did so under Roman oversight, with Roman generals and governors increasingly shaping Judean politics through strategic appointments and alliances. One of Rome's most consequential decisions was the installation of Herod the Great as king in 37 BC. An Idumean by ancestry but fully integrated into Jewish society, Herod ruled with unwavering Roman support and crafted a hybrid political identity that blended Jewish tradition with Roman imperial culture. His reign left an enormous imprint on the land. He rebuilt the Second Temple on a monumental scale, constructed Roman-style cities such as Caesarea Maritima and Sebaste, and maintained order through a combination of political acumen and ruthless force. When Herod died in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided among his sons, creating the fragmented political landscapes that formed the backdrop of the Gospel's early chapters. The situation shifted again in AD 6, when Herod's son Archelaus was deposed and Judea was placed under direct Roman administration. The most famous of these Roman prefects was Pontius Pilate from AD 26 to 36, whose insensitivity to Jewish customs and heavy-handed governance made him a symbol of the growing tension between Roman authority and Jewish identity. His authorization of Jesus' crucifixion reflects the volatile atmosphere of the period, in which political pressure, religious conviction, and imperial power collided. Roman rule in Judea, from Pompey's conquest in 63 BC to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, was marked by political manipulation, shifting degrees of autonomy, increasing direct Roman control, and deepening social, economic, and religious tensions. These pressures contributed to the rise of revolutionary movements and ultimately culminated in the catastrophic end of the Second Temple. This era profoundly shaped the world of Jesus and the early church, laid the groundwork for the development of rabbinic Judaism, and set the stage for the long Jewish diaspora that followed. The Roman conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Byzantines. When Constantine the Great elevated Christianity to a favored position within the Roman Empire and shifted the imperial capital to Constantinople, the eastern provinces entered a transformative new era. From the 4th to the 7th century, the Levant became one of the most vibrant and religiously significant regions of the Byzantine world. Christianity shapes nearly every aspect of life: law, culture, architecture, and public identity, turning the region into a center of global Christian devotion. This map shows how the Byzantines divided up the land into regions, keeping the Roman name of Palestina intact. This transformation was visible everywhere. Massive church building programs reshaped both cities and villages, while pilgrimage routes connected Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the Jordan River to the wider Christian world. Monasticism flourished in the Judean desert and Sinai, producing spiritual movements that would influence Christianity for centuries. Bishops emerged as major civic leaders, blurring the lines between religious and political authority. In this period, Christianity was not merely a belief system, it became the organizing principle of society. Urban life in the Levant thrived under Byzantine administration. Roman theaters, bathhouses, and marketplaces remained active, even as new basilicas came to dominate city centers. Greek and Syriac inscriptions adorned public buildings, and municipal councils managed local affairs, with considerable autonomy. Cities such as Jerusalem, Caesarea, Antioch, Gaza, and Scythopolis grew into major cultural and economic hubs, linking the Levant to the broader Mediterranean world. Jerusalem in particular experienced a dramatic rebirth. Under the patronage of Constantine's mother Helena, the city was rebuilt as a Christian capital. The construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 335, the expansion of the city's walls, and the booming pilgrimage economy transformed Jerusalem into one of the most important cities in the empire by the 6th century. Beyond the cities, rural life remained the backbone of Levantine society. Most people lived in villages marked by terraced agriculture, olives, grapes, and grains, and by small local churches that tied rural communities into the wider Christian landscape. Greek, Aramaic, and Syriac were spoken side by side, reflecting the region's cultural diversity. Compared to earlier centuries, the countryside enjoyed relative stability and prosperity, and it became a cradle of Christian monastic life. Yet the Levant also sat on the frontier between Byzantium and the Sasanian Persian Empire, a position that brought both opportunity and danger. Frequent wars strained the region, culminating in the devastating Persian invasion of 614, which captured Jerusalem and disrupted the pilgrimage economy. Although Emperor Heraclius reconquered the region in 628, both empires were exhausted, just as the Arab Ishmaelite conquests began sweeping across the Near East in the 630s and 640s. Despite Christianity's dominance, the Levant remained religiously diverse. Chalcedonian Christians, Monophysites, Jews, Samaritans, and Arab Christian tribes all lived within the region, often with competing identities and theological commitments. Doctrinal disputes sometimes erupted into unrest, and imperial attempts to enforce orthodoxy could be heavy-handed, adding to local tensions. Life in the Byzantine Levant was shaped by the Christianization of public and private life, urban prosperity, monumental architecture, pilgrimage, and monasticism. It was a region of cultural richness and religious diversity, yet also one strained by frontier warfare and imperial politics. By the time the Levant came under early Islamic rule in the 8th century, it had become a deeply Christian, economically interconnected, and culturally sophisticated part of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The Byzantine conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Sasanians. In the early 7th century, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires became locked in one of the most destructive wars of late antiquity, and the Levant, especially the Holy Land, found itself at the center of the conflict. This map shows the Sasanian Empire at its apex during the Sasanian-Byzantine War of 602 to 628. The darker shade of turquoise shows the territories controlled by the Sasanian Empire, and the lighter shade is the Roman-Byzantine territory controlled by the Sasanians from 603 to 628. By 614, the Persian general Shah-Baraz launched a sweeping campaign through Syria and into the Holy Land, exploiting the weakened state of Byzantine defenses and the political turmoil within the empire. Persian armies captured Damascus, Tiberias, and key coastal cities with startling speed, aided in some regions by local Jewish communities who hoped Persian rule would bring relief from restrictive Byzantine religious policies. By spring, the Persians were at the gates of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, heavily fortified and symbolically central to Byzantine Christianity, resisted for nearly 3 weeks. When the Persians finally stormed the city, the result was catastrophic. Large sections of Jerusalem were burned, many Christian inhabitants were killed or enslaved, and churches and monasteries suffered extensive destruction. Byzantine Christian sources remembered the event as one of the greatest disasters of their age. Among the most dramatic consequences was the capture of the True Cross, the empire's most sacred relic, which was carried off to the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. Its loss became a symbol of divine judgment and imperial humiliation, and Emperor Heraclius would later make its recovery a central goal of his counteroffensive. The invasion also exposed deep fractures within the region's population. Some Jewish groups allied with the Persians, hoping for relief from Byzantine oppression, and were briefly permitted to resettle in Jerusalem after the conquest. Christian writers, however, interpreted the invasion as a religious calamity and later blamed Jewish communities for collaborating with the enemy. When the Byzantines eventually regained control, reprisals against the Jewish populations followed, intensifying sectarian tensions that had simmered for centuries. Persian administration in the region was generally pragmatic. Local elites, Christian, Jewish, and Samaritan, were incorporated into governance. Taxation was reorganized, but not excessively burdensome, and religious communities enjoyed a degree of autonomy. Yet Jerusalem remained damaged and partly depopulated, and the region as a whole bore the scars of war. Persian rule lasted 14 years, ending only when Emperor Heraclius launched a dramatic and ultimately successful reconquest. In 628, Heraclius defeated the Persians and restored Byzantine authority. The True Cross was triumphantly returned to Jerusalem, but the victory was bittersweet. The region was economically devastated, its population depleted, and its social fabric strained by years of conflict and reprisals. This exhaustion left both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires dangerously vulnerable, just as the Arab Ishmaelite conquests began sweeping across the Near East in the 630s and 640s. The Persian invasion of 614 was one of the most traumatic events in Byzantine Palestine. The Persians captured Jerusalem after a brutal siege, carrying off the True Cross and exposing deep Jewish-Christian tensions. Persian rule lasted until 628, but the devastation it left behind weakened the region at precisely the moment a new power was rising. The conflict reshaped the Levant and set the stage for the profound transformations that followed under early Islamic rule. The Sasanian conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Islamic caliphates. The Ishmaelite Umayyad dynasty, who were Arian Christians, conquered the Levant in the mid-7th century. The Umayyads later became Islamic under Abd al-Malik, who ruled 685 to 705. Abd al-Malik created the religion of Islam by inventing a man named Muhammad from the Semitic title of Mahmed, which means anointed one, and building the city of Mecca in the Hijaz for the adherents of the new religion to make pilgrimages to. The Holy Land transitioned from a Byzantine Christian heartland into a province of the newly invented Islamic world. Yet this transformation was far more gradual and layered than a simple religious or cultural replacement. Islam became the ruling religion, but conversion unfolded slowly over centuries. Christians and Jews, now classified as dhimmis, retained their faith, clergy, and communal institutions, and churches and synagogues continued to function. Arabic gradually replaced Greek, Syriac, and Aramaic as the language of administration, but local customs and village life persisted with remarkable continuity. For generations, the Levant remained a religiously mixed society where Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Samaritans lived side by side. Urban centers flourished under the new caliphates. Cities such as Damascus, Jerusalem, Ramla, Gaza, and Aleppo bustled with markets, public baths, roadside inns, and expanding mosques and Islamic schools. Roman Byzantine infrastructure remained in use, blending seamlessly with new Islamic architectural forms. Damascus, elevated as the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate from 661 to 750, became the political heart of the Islamic world, transforming the Levant into a center of imperial power and cultural innovation. Jerusalem also assumed a new role within the Islamic world. The construction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque established the city as a major Islamic holy site, yet Christian pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre continued, and Jewish communities, long restricted under Byzantine rule, were allowed to return. Jerusalem thus became a shared sacred space, revered by all three Abrahamic religions. We have an Abrahamic religion series. You can find the link in the description below. Rural life remained the backbone of Levantine society. Most people lived in villages, farming olives, wheat, figs, grapes, and dates. Taxes were now paid in Arabic, often in cash rather than kind, but daily rhythms changed little. Extended families continued to shape village life, and local Christian and Muslim traditions defined community identity. The countryside benefited from integration into a vast economic network stretching from Spain to India, which brought stability and prosperity to many rural regions. Economically, the Levant became a key node in a massive Afro-Eurasian trade system. Spices from India, silk from China, glass and textiles from Syria, and olive oil and wine from the Holy Land moved through its ports and caravan routes. Pilgrims, merchants, and scholars traveled between Mecca, Baghdad, Cairo, and the Levant's major cities, weaving the region into the intellectual and commercial fabric of the Islamic world. Culturally, the Levant contributed significantly to the Islamic Golden Age. Arabic emerged as a language of literature, science, and administration, while Christian and Jewish scholars played an important role in translating Greek works into Arabic. Cities like Damascus and Jerusalem became centers of scholarship, poetry, and jurisprudence. Islamic art and architecture blended with older Byzantine styles, creating a distinctive Levantine aesthetic. The region became a crossroads of culture where Greek, Syriac, Jewish, and Arab traditions interacted and enriched one another. Politically, the Levant experienced several transitions. The Umayyads, from 661 to 750, centralized power in Damascus, while the Abbasids, from 750 to the 10th century, shifted the imperial center to Baghdad, but maintained the Levant as an important frontier and administrative zone. Later, local dynasties such as the Tulunids, Ikhshidids, and Fatimids governed the region. Northern Syria saw periodic warfare with Byzantium, but the Promised Land remained relatively stable until the upheavals of the 11th century. Life in the Levant under the Islamic caliphates was shaped by religious diversity, urban prosperity, agricultural stability, cultural blending, and deep economic integration. By the time the Crusaders arrived in 1099, the region had become a richly interconnected, culturally vibrant, and religiously diverse part of the Islamic world, one shaped as much by continuity as by change. The Islamic conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structure, and even its official nomenclature. Crusaders. When the Crusaders established their states in the Levant after 1099, they entered a region already shaped by centuries of cultural exchange, religious diversity, and economic interconnection. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa ruled over a population far more varied than the Latin Christian elites who had conquered it. Western Europeans formed only a thin ruling layer atop a mosaic of Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syriac, Armenian, and Maronite, alongside large Muslim communities, Jewish minorities, and Bedouin tribes who moved across the frontiers. Despite the violence of conquest, daily life often involved negotiation, coexistence, and pragmatic accommodation. Urban centers became the beating heart of Crusader society. Cities such as Jerusalem, Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, and Antioch emerged as cosmopolitan hubs of trade and culture. Markets overflowed with spices, textiles, glassware, and metalwork, while merchants from Italy, France, Byzantium, and the Islamic world mingled in the streets. Mixed neighborhoods housed Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and institutions such as hospitals, monasteries, and roadside inns served travelers and locals alike. Fortified walls and Crusader citadels dominated the skylines, but the cities themselves remained deeply interconnected with the wider Mediterranean economy. Acre, in particular, became one of the busiest ports of the medieval world. Beyond the cities, rural life continued with remarkable continuity. Most people lived in villages and farmed the land much as they had under Islamic rule. Local peasants, mostly Muslims or Eastern Christians, maintained traditional agricultural practices, irrigation systems, and terraced fields. Taxes were collected in familiar ways, even as new feudal estates appeared under Frankish lords. Castles rose across the countryside to secure farmland and trade routes, and some villages were repopulated with settlers from Europe. Yet the everyday rhythm of rural life changed little, revealing the deep resilience of Levantine village society. Religion shaped the landscape in complex ways. Latin Christians controlled major shrines, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and introduced Western monastic orders like the Templars, Hospitallers, and Cistercians. Eastern Christians often retained their own clergy and rights, and in some cases preferred Crusader rule to Byzantine or Muslim taxation. Muslims continued to practice their faith under certain restrictions, paying special taxes but often keeping property and local leadership. Many towns and villages maintained functioning mosques. Jewish communities, though small, persisted in coastal cities, engaging in trade, crafts, and scholarship. Jerusalem became a Latin Christian capital, yet it remained spiritually significant to all three Abrahamic faiths. The Crusader states were militarized societies, constantly defending their borders. Massive castles such as Crac des Chevaliers and Bellevoir anchored frontier life, while knightly orders served as both monks and soldiers. Warfare with neighboring Muslim powers was frequent, but diplomacy, truces, and trade were equally common. Long stretches of peaceful coexistence punctuated the periods of conflict, reflecting the pragmatic realities of life in a diverse and interconnected region. Economically, the Crusader states thrived as a crossroads of Mediterranean commerce. Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa dominated trade, exporting sugar, olive oil, wine, and glass, while importing spices, silk, and luxury goods from the Islamic world. Pilgrimage traffic brought wealth and travelers from across Europe. The Levant became a bridge between East and West, linking European markets with the commercial networks of the Middle East. Culturally, the region was far more than a battleground of civilizations. It became a zone of intense exchange. Frankish settlers adopted local foods, clothing, and architectural styles. Arabic words entered the Crusader French dialects. Medical knowledge flowed between Muslim and Christian physicians, and artistic traditions blended Western and Eastern motifs. The result was a hybrid society, neither fully European nor fully Middle Eastern, but something distinctly Levantine. The Crusader states gradually contracted under pressure from rising Muslim powers, especially under Saladin in the late 12th century and the Mamluks in the 13th. Jerusalem fell in 1187, and Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, fell in 1291, ending nearly 2 centuries of Latin Christian rule. Life in the Crusader states was shaped by a Latin Christian ruling class governing a diverse population, thriving urban centers, a largely continuous rural economy, constant warfare, and deep cultural blending across religious and ethnic lines. It was a world of contrasts, crusading zeal alongside pragmatic coexistence, European newcomers interacting with ancient Levantine traditions, and fortified castles rising above bustling, multicultural cities. The European conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Ottomans. When the Ottomans incorporated the Levant into their empire in the early 16th century, they inherited one of the most culturally and religiously diverse regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. Stretching across what is now Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel-Palestine, the Levant was home to Sunni Muslims, Shia communities, Greek Orthodox and Syriac Christians, Maronites, Armenians, Jews, Druze, Alawites, and Bedouin tribes. The Ottomans governed this mosaic through the millet system, which allowed religious communities to manage their own courts, schools, and internal affairs. This structure fostered a society in which multiple identities coexisted under the umbrella of imperial rule. Urban life flourished in cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, Jerusalem, Beirut, and Gaza. These were vibrant centers of trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange. Bustling souks, which were Arab marketplaces, offered textiles, spices, soap, and metalwork, while caravanserais, which were roadside inns, hosted merchants from Anatolia, Persia, Arabia, and Europe. Public baths, coffee houses, and religious schools animated daily life, and strong craft guilds regulated trade. Aleppo in particular became one of the most important commercial hubs of the Eastern Mediterranean, linking European markets with Persia and India through both overland and maritime routes. Rural life, meanwhile, remained the foundation of Levantine society. Most people lived in villages and worked the land, cultivating wheat, olives, grapes, citrus, and cotton. Taxes were paid to local notables, or timar, holding cavalrymen, and communal irrigation systems sustained agriculture. Extended families formed the core of village life, and local sheiks or clan leaders often wielded more practical authority than distant Ottoman officials. This decentralized structure allowed rural communities to maintain stability and continuity across generations. Jerusalem held a special place within the empire. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the city's walls were rebuilt, and the Ottomans took care to protect Christian holy sites and pilgrimage routes. Jewish communities flourished in Safed, Tiberias, and Jerusalem, benefiting from the arrival of Sephardic refugees expelled from Spain. The city became a carefully managed sacred space, shared, sometimes uneasily, by its many religious communities. Economically, the Levant served as a crossroads of global trade. Silk from Mount Lebanon, soap from Nablus, cotton from the Holy Land and Syria, and olive oil and citrus fruits flowed through its ports. Mediterranean cities such as Beirut and Acre connected the region to Venice, Marseille, and later British and French markets, while inland caravan routes linked Damascus to Mecca and Baghdad. Trade brought prosperity, but also drew European powers into the region, each seeking influence over its strategic routes and resources. Culturally, the Levant was rich and intellectually active. Arabic remained the dominant language, though Turkish, Armenian, and other tongues were heard in its cities. Coffee houses became centers of storytelling, poetry, and political discussion. Madrasas, or Islamic colleges, and monasteries preserved scholarship, while architecture blended Ottoman, Arab, and local traditions. By the 19th century, Beirut emerged as a center of the Arab Nahda, or cultural renaissance, producing new literature, newspapers, and political thought. The later Ottoman period brought significant challenges and transformations. Local revolts, such as the Druze-Maronite conflicts in Mount Lebanon, strained imperial authority. European intervention increased, global trade routes shifted, and the Tanzimat reforms sought to modernize law, taxation, and citizenship. These changes produced new schools, newspapers, and political movements, as well as rising national identities among Arabs, Armenians, and other groups. The Levant became a region where modernization and tension unfolded side by side. World War I brought devastation. Famine, conscription, and military campaigns ravaged the population, and by 1917 to 1918, British and Arab forces had captured the Levant, ending 4 centuries of Turkish-Ottoman rule. Life in the Ottoman Levant was shaped by religious and cultural diversity, thriving urban centers, stable but locally driven rural life, Jerusalem's unique sacred status, and gradual modernization. It was a world where tradition and empire coexisted with commerce, scholarship, and slow but steady change, setting the stage for the profound political transformations of the 20th century. The Ottoman conquerors asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. British. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, Britain emerged as the new imperial power in much of the Levant. Under the League of Nations mandate system, Britain assumed control of Palestine, including what is now Israel and the West Bank, and Transjordan, the territory that would become modern Jordan. Although the mandates were officially intended to prepare these regions for self-government, in practice they introduced a new, highly centralized imperial order. British officials governed from Jerusalem and Amman, establishing new legal systems, police forces, and administrative structures. English joined Arabic and Hebrew as a language of government, and the region shifted from the decentralized rhythms of Ottoman provincial life to a more bureaucratic and globally connected system. The population of the British-ruled Levant was extraordinarily diverse. Arabs, both Muslim and Christian, formed the majority, alongside long-established Jewish communities, Druze, Circassians, Bedouin tribes, Armenians, and refugees displaced by World War I. Cities were multilingual and multicultural, while villages preserved older traditions and social rhythms. Religious institutions remained central to identity, and the British often governed through local leaders, inadvertently reinforcing existing communal divisions. Urban centers expanded rapidly under British rule. Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Amman, and the newly formed city of Tel Aviv grew into modern hubs of administration, commerce, and culture. New roads, railways, and ports connected the region to global markets. Schools, hospitals, and universities multiplied, while cafes, cinemas, and newspapers fostered new forms of public life. Tel Aviv emerged as a modern Jewish metropolis, while Amman transformed from a small settlement into the capital of Transjordan. A growing middle class and professional elite began to shape the region's political and cultural landscape. Rural life, however, remained deeply traditional. Most Arabs in Palestine and Transjordan lived in villages, farming olives, citrus, wheat, and vegetables. Clan networks structured social life, and seasoned labor tied villages to nearby towns. British rule introduced new agricultural techniques, land registration, and taxation reforms, and rural economies became increasingly tied to urban markets and global trade. Yet the fundamental rhythms of village life persisted, creating a stark contrast with the rapidly modernizing cities. The formation of Jordan. Jordan's emergence as a modern nation was shaped by the geopolitical upheavals following World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The territory east of the Jordan River was designated as Transjordan, and in 1921 Britain installed Emir Abdullah, son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, as its ruler. This move was partly strategic, aimed at preventing French expansion from neighboring Syria and rewarding the Hashemites for their role in the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. Although Transjordan remained under British oversight, it operated with significant autonomy. Emir Abdullah governed the region with British support, establishing administrative institutions and consolidating his authority. Over time, Transjordan developed a distinct political identity, separate from the neighboring Mandate of Palestine. On May 25, 1946, Transjordan achieved full independence from Britain and was renamed the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Abdullah became king, and the new nation quickly joined the Arab League, asserting its place in the regional political landscape. Jordan's territorial ambitions briefly expanded after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War when it annexed the West Bank, though this territory was later lost in the 1967 Six-Day War. When Britain created the Emirate of Transjordan in 1921, it administered it separately from Palestine and applied different rules. One of the key distinctions was Article 25 of the Mandate, which allowed Britain to suspend the provisions related to establishing a Jewish national home east of the Jordan River, and that's exactly what it did. Here's what that meant in practice. Jewish immigration and land purchases were prohibited in Transjordan by British policy from the early 1920s onward. As a result, no significant Jewish communities developed there during the Mandate, unlike in Western Palestine, where Jewish immigration was legally permitted and often encouraged. There were individual Jewish traders or travelers, as had existed in earlier centuries, but not organized settlements or recognized communities. By the 1930s and 40s, Transjordan's population was overwhelmingly Arab Muslim, with small Arab Christian, Circassian, and Chechen minorities, but not Jewish. The absence of Jewish settlements east of the Jordan wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate political compromise. Britain used Transjordan as a buffer state under the Hashemite dynasty and kept it outside the Zionist project. The formation of Palestine. The Mandate period also witnessed profound demographic and political change driven by Jewish immigration. Waves of immigrants, especially from Europe, established kibbutzim, collective communities, and moshavim, cooperative communities of farmers, revived Hebrew as a spoken language, and built new cultural and political institutions. Land purchases and new settlements expanded Jewish presence in the region, often generating tension with Arab communities. This map shows the three different proposals for the post-World War I administration of Palestine. The red line is the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement border proposal by the International Administration. The dotted blue line is the 1919 Zionist Organization proposal at the Paris Peace Conference. And the solid blue line is final border of the 1920 to 1948 Mandatory Palestine. By the 1930s and 1940s, the Mandate was marked by escalating conflict. Arab opposition to Jewish immigration and British policies erupted in the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, prompting harsh British crackdowns. Jewish-British tensions also intensified, especially as Britain restricted Jewish immigration during the Holocaust. Underground Jewish militias, Haganah, Irgun, and Lahi, carried out attacks on British targets, and by the end of World War II, Britain found itself unable to maintain control. During the British Mandate, 1920 to 1948, the territories of Palestine and Transjordan were home to a mosaic of ethnic and religious communities shaped by centuries of migration, empire, and local tradition. In Palestine, the population included Arab-speaking Muslim majorities alongside substantial Christian Arab communities, Jewish communities, both long established and newly arrived through waves of Zionist immigration, as well as smaller groups such as Druze, Samaritans, Circassians, Armenians, and various Christian denominations tied to ancient churches. Transjordan, governed separately under the Hashemite Emirate, was predominantly Sunni Muslim, with tribal Bedouin populations forming the social backbone, but it also included Christian Arabs, Circassians, and Chechens, who had settled there in the late Ottoman period. Together, these regions reflected a complex social landscape where diverse identities coexisted under the shifting political pressures of the Mandate era. The rise of Zionism. The rise of Zionism during the British Mandate transformed the political and cultural landscape of the Holy Land. The turning point came in 1917 when Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, publicly supporting the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. This Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. This statement gave Zionism unprecedented international legitimacy, encouraged Jewish immigration, and alarmed the Arab population, who feared political displacement. When the Mandate Charter incorporated the Balfour Declaration, Zionist development became an official component of British policy, setting the stage for profound demographic and political change. Zionism advanced primarily through waves of immigration, called Aliyot, driven by both ideological commitment and the pressures of rising anti-Semitism in Europe. The third Aliyah, 1919 to 1923, brought young socialist pioneers who built farms and infrastructure. The fourth Aliyah, 1924 to 1929, consisted largely of middle-class immigrants from Eastern Europe, and the fifth Aliyah, 1933 to 1939, was propelled by refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. These immigrants brought capital, skills, and a sense of urgency that reshaped the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in the Holy Land. By the 1940s, the Jewish share of the population had grown from roughly 10% to more than 30%. By the late 1940s, Britain could no longer manage the escalating conflict between Jewish and Arab communities. The issue was referred to the United Nations, which proposed the 1947 partition plan calling for separate Jewish and Arab states. Violence intensified, and in 1948, Britain withdrew from Palestine. Its departure led directly to the establishment of the State of Israel and the outbreak of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, reshaping the region in ways that continue to reverberate. Zionism was not only a political movement, it was a society in formation. The Yeshuv developed its own institutions, including the Jewish Agency, the Histadrut Labor Federation, the Haganah Defense Organization, and a network of kibbutzim, collective community, and moshevim, cooperative communities of farmers. Hebrew language schools, newspapers, and universities fostered a cultural renaissance. Tel Aviv, founded in 1909, grew rapidly into a modern Hebrew-speaking city, symbolizing the emergence of a new cultural identity distinct from both Europe and the Middle East. This cultural confidence strengthened the movement's cohesion and sense of purpose. Arab response to Zionism during the Mandate. The Arab response to Zionism during the British Mandate was shaped by a profound sense of shock, dispossession, and political awakening. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, Palestinian Arabs expected independence after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, not a British-backed project to establish a Jewish national homeland in their land. The declaration stunned the population and immediately triggered petitions, protests, and the formation of local political societies. Arab leaders demanded representative government and rejected Zionism as a colonial enterprise that threatened their majority status and control over the land. During the 1920s, Palestinian Arabs developed a more organized political movement. National congresses articulated demands for self-rule. Newspapers and political clubs spread anti-Zionist arguments, and leadership coalesced around notable families such as the Husseini and Nashashibi clans. A distinct Palestinian national identity began to take shape, rooted in the conviction that Palestine was an Arab country and that Zionism was incompatible with the rights of the majority population. Tensions escalated as Zionist land purchases and waves of Jewish immigration increased. Many Arab peasants feared the loss of their livelihoods, and the rapid demographic changes created deep anxiety. The development of separate Jewish economic and social institutions heightened the sense of exclusion. These pressures contributed to outbreaks of violence in 1920, 1921, and 1929, including the deadly riots in Jerusalem and Hebron, which left lasting scars on both communities. The most dramatic expression of Arab resistance came with the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a mass uprising against both British rule and Zionist immigration. The revolt combined general strikes, attacks on British infrastructure, and guerrilla warfare in the countryside. It also exposed deep divisions within Arab society as rival factions competed for influence. Britain crushed the revolt with overwhelming force, leaving the Arab leadership fragmented and weakened on the eve of World War II. In response to the revolt, Britain issued the 1939 White Paper, which limited Jewish immigration and promised eventual Arab majority rule. Many Arabs welcomed the policy as a partial victory, though others distrusted British intentions. Zionist leaders rejected it outright, intensifying Jewish-British tensions. The White Paper marked the high point of Arab political influence during the Mandate, but it did not resolve the underlying conflict. World War II and the Holocaust transformed the political landscape. Global sympathy for Jewish refugees grew, and Zionist diplomacy intensified. Arab concerns deepened as Jewish immigration resumed, and the military strength of the Yishuv increased. Arab leaders argued that Palestinians should not bear the consequences of European anti-Semitism, insisting that their own national rights must be protected. The crisis reached its climax with the UN Partition Plan of 1947, which proposed separate Jewish and Arab states. Arabs rejected the plan as unjust and illegitimate, viewing it as the loss of their homeland. Civil war erupted between Arab and Jewish communities, and neighboring Arab states prepared for intervention. Zionists, by contrast, saw the plan as long-awaited international recognition. The conflict spiraled toward Britain's withdrawal and the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948. The Arab response to Zionism during the Mandate was shaped by fears of displacement, the rise of Palestinian nationalism, opposition to British support for Zionism, land and labor conflicts, mass mobilization during the Arab Revolt, and rejection of partition. By 1948, Palestinian Arab society had undergone a profound political awakening, but was also deeply fractured, a key factor in the conflict that allowed Britain's departure. Like every imperial power before it, the British Empire asserted authority over the region by determining its inhabitants, its governing structures, and even its official nomenclature. Under the terms of the British Mandate, the Hashemite dynasty was granted governance over the largest portion, designated as Transjordan, while the Zionist government was eventually granted governance over a smaller portion, which became the State of Israel in 1948. Although the administrative division of the territory heavily favored Arab governance, many Arab leaders and communities remained dissatisfied, seeking political control over the entirety of the land. These maps illustrate the territorial boundaries as they were determined under British rule, compared to how they are today. The Zionist leadership accepted significant territorial compromises, ceding areas allocated to them by both the British authorities and the United Nations, in an effort to achieve a negotiated peace with the Arab populations who also inhabited the region. It's important to note that Jewish communities maintained a continuous presence in the land for more than 2 millennia. Although they often constituted a demographic minority, they were never entirely absent. By the early 20th century, Arab populations formed the majority, but this demographic reality did not necessarily obligate British administrators to grant them exclusive governance over the entire Levant. British policy, in fact, restricted Jewish immigration to Transjordan, effectively reserving that territory for Arab administration. Despite these arrangements, the region has experienced persistent conflict since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Treatment of the people. So far, we have addressed the question of governance, how the Levant was partitioned by its most recent conquerors, granting the Zionist movement authority over the Holy Land, and the question of individual belonging, the idea that a person belongs to the place of their birth. What remains is the final issue, how that governing authority treats the people under its control. Life for Palestinians in Israel, 1948 to 2021. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, roughly 150,000 Palestinians remained within its borders. They became citizens of the new state, but their experience was shaped from the beginning by a tension between formal citizenship and structural inequality. Israel defined itself as a Jewish state, and Palestinians, now a national minority, found themselves navigating a complex reality of inclusion and exclusion, integration and discrimination. From 1948 to 1966, Palestinian citizens lived under military rule. Although they held Israeli citizenship and voting rights, their daily lives were tightly controlled. Travel between towns required permits, curfews were common, and internal checkpoints restricted movement. Emergency regulations enabled widespread land confiscations, and political expression was limited. Education and employment opportunities were closely monitored by the state. This period left deep psychological and social scars, shaping long-term feelings of marginalization and mistrust. Land loss was one of the most consequential aspects of early statehood. Through expropriation laws and emergency measures, Israel seized large areas of Palestinian land, displacing many families who became present absentees, internal refugees unable to return to their homes. Agricultural communities lost farmland, and new Jewish towns were built on or near former Palestinian villages. Land remained a central political issue for decades, fueling protests such as the landmark Land Day demonstrations in 1976. Citizenship brought certain rights, voting, access to public services, and participation in political life, but equality was far from realized. Palestinians faced discriminatory laws in land allocation and housing, underfunded municipalities, limited representation in state institutions, and persistent security-based suspicion. They were citizens, yet not fully equal citizens. Despite these constraints, Palestinian society inside Israel rebuilt itself with resilience. Arabic language schools, cultural institutions, and religious communities, Muslim, Christian, and Druze, remained active. A Palestinian middle class slowly emerged, and writers, poets, and intellectuals helped preserve cultural identity. Many Palestinians developed a dual sense of belonging, Palestinian by heritage, Israeli by citizenship. From the 1970s onward, economic integration increased. Palestinians entered construction, agriculture, public sector jobs, universities, and professional fields such as medicine, law, and engineering. Economic mobility improved, but income gaps and employment discrimination persisted. Integration was real but uneven. Political mobilization grew as well. Land Day in 1976 marked a turning point as Palestinians protested land confiscations and asserted their collective rights. In October 2000, the killing of 13 Palestinian citizens by Israeli police during demonstrations deepened mistrust and highlighted the fragility of state-minority relations. Over time, Palestinian political parties gained representation in the Knesset, creating a vibrant, if often contentious, political sphere. By the early 21st century, everyday life for Palestinian citizens of Israel existed in a hybrid space between integration and separation. Many worked alongside Jewish Israelis, attended Israeli universities, and participated in national elections. They had access to healthcare and social services, yet residential patterns remained largely segregated, with Arab and Jewish towns rarely mixing. School systems were divided into Arabic and Hebrew tracks. Housing discrimination, zoning restrictions, and security profiling, especially at airports, reinforced social boundaries. Life was neither fully segregated nor fully integrated. Regional conflicts also shaped their experience. Wars in Gaza and Lebanon heightened suspicion toward Arab citizens, and police crackdowns during protests strained relations further. The intercommunal violence in mixed cities such as Lod and Acre in 2021 revealed how quickly tensions could erupt, even after long periods of coexistence. Human rights organizations have long highlighted structural inequalities, pointing to discriminatory land policies, unequal resource allocation, and restrictions in East Jerusalem. These assessments form part of an ongoing international debate about the nature of the system and the lived reality of Palestinian citizens. From 1948 to 2021, Palestinians in Israel experienced a complex and often contradictory reality: citizenship without full equality, economic progress alongside structural barriers, cultural resilience amid political marginalization, and periods of coexistence punctuated by moments of deep conflict. Their lives were shaped by both integration into Israeli society and exclusion from its centers of power, producing a unique identity and a distinctive set of challenges. Taken together, the historical record and the biblical witness point toward a single consistent reality. Every earthly claim to the Holy Land is provisional. The modern Palestinian identity, though relatively recent in its formation, reflects a genuine people shaped by geography, memory, and political struggle. The Jewish people, by contrast, have maintained an unbroken sense of peoplehood across millennia, preserving language, law, and longing even in dispersion. When the British Empire divided the region, it followed the same pattern as every empire before it, assigning governance according to its own interests. In that process, the Zionist movement received the authority to govern a portion of the land, and the State of Israel emerged as the political expression of a people whose identity long predated the modern state system. Yet governance is not the same as moral license. While Israel holds the right to govern the territory assigned to it, Scripture does not grant any earthly authority the right to mistreat those under its rule. The lived experience of Palestinians within Israel, marked by both integration and inequality, remains a reminder that political authority carries ethical responsibility. At the same time, many Arab groups continue to reject any Jewish governance in the region, seeking control over the entire Levant and refusing to accept the existence of the State of Israel. But above all these competing claims stands the biblical truth that the land does not ultimately belong to Palestinians, to Jews, or to any empire that has ever ruled it. It belongs to Yeshua Messiah. Both groups, like all who have come before them, are temporary occupants of a land that awaits its rightful king. When he returns, he'll reclaim what is his, judge those who have misused their authority, and establish a kingdom in which justice is no longer contested but perfectly fulfilled. You can find links to our sources for this study in the description below. We hope you've been blessed by this study. Shalom.